This program was produced with the generous financial support of viewers like you through the NET Foundation.
The focus of the presidential politics was on Nebraska.
The truth is, it was an exciting time to be around.
Hundreds of party faithful gathered to pay their respects and to work up their enthusiasm for the long campaign that lies ahead.
A once-in-a-lifetime set of events in 1968 put the state on the election year map.
Well, Kennedy was the rock star.
Because when Nebraska does well, the rest of the country does well.
This is the make it or break it primary for us.
To carry on the policy of bringing the war to an end.
Candidates for president, protests in the street, new young faces charged into politics.
It was a time of great change, and that shakes people up.
I say the American people can't afford 4 more years of the failures of the past 4 years.
Those were issues that went to the core of what we believed in, and we still believe in.
If we can't help create the conditions for a just and an enduring peace, who do you think can?
You know, we don't have to take this anymore. We can make a difference.
The dream ended for some and energized others, shaping Nebraska politics for a generation.
It just kind of built and built and built until Election Day came, and then all hell broke loose.
Making our young question the very promise of American life itself.
It means that you played a part in history.
I think we have an obligation to this total community, as we do to the ghetto. I'm sure we recognize that, but there will be law and order. That's the only way that a democracy can exist. Anarchy cannot be allowed to flourish in this community.
It wasn't just Detroit and LA. White and black divided America in the 1960s, and it divided Omaha, Nebraska.
And you had to go to work with these people, you had to live with these people, and Omaha wasn't a big metropolis like now, it was a small city.
From the early 60s, Archie Godfrey had always been a walking contradiction, a Republican civil rights activist.
Those issues kept pushing the envelope that as a black person in the city, you start realizing where you stood in the scheme of things.
The general mood was, gee, Omaha's not a bad town. Why is this happening?
John Prescott edited The Gateway, the student newspaper at the University of Nebraska, Omaha.
The white community looked at it as lawlessness, and many people in the African American community looked at it as simply things have got to change.
Enter George Wallace, the former governor of Alabama. He's running for president.
We say that millions of dollars being spent today out of Washington with thousands of briefcase-toting bureaucrats who not only come to your state, but to my state, telling the average
George Wallace is an icon of segregationists, separatists, and everything that was negative toward black people in politics.
If he could pose some solutions to our pressing problems, aside from his racist and bigot views, which he is, then maybe we could take another look at him. I don't.
Wallace needed to gather several hundred signatures to get his American Party ticket on the ballot in Nebraska. He planned to appear at a special party convention in Omaha.
The governor has no illusions about the odds of winning. However, he is in this to win.
Before the convention, Wallace spoke to a political science class at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. Only 2 reporters present, including the student newspaper.
When Governor Wallace arrived, it was interesting because the other candidates, we didn't have the bodyguard surrounding him like Governor Wallace did.
We feel he's a hindrance to the progress of our country, and we don't want such a person as president. So I feel I should be here.
It was bringing out a segment of the Omaha population that basically favored the ideas and the segregationist issues and platforms that he was standing on. So we felt that we couldn't sit by and just let that come to our town without us showing up.
He's out of jail.
It was almost like in your face.
Turns out there were hundreds of Nebraskans who supported Wallace. A lot of people also came out of curiosity.
It was at the Civic Auditorium, which was, of course, close to Creighton University. So Tom and I went. We were able to sit in the upper levels. We weren't allowed on the floor.
We want freedom, send Wallace home. We want freedom.
I mean, it was 50% African Americans and 50% whites protesting against Wallace. Well, when you went in there, unless you had signs, you couldn't tell. The whites just kind of blended in, so it just looked like a group of African Americans protesting, but that was not the point.
The images of angry blacks disrupting a political convention served the cause of Wallace's race politics as well.
This is not a matter of race. It's a matter of anarchists and revolutionaries who do not care about any institution in Nebraska or the United States.
It was really high theater. You had the convention in the heartland because you wanted to try and get some publicity, and people fell right into it. They intended to have a riot, and they ended up with a riot.
Lots of swinging of clubs and screaming and pushing, and we were getting ready to leave, and I remember they were beating on some people, and I told Tom, I said, we can't let this happen, and they were beating, and he said, we've got to leave.
For all the chaos, there was only one arrest, a young black high school student put on trial for disturbing the peace.
You know, we had some distraction a moment ago by the freedom of speech folks that believe in free speech for everybody but themselves. They don't mind a communist. They don't mind people speaking on college campuses and advocating communist victory, but they don't want somebody like us to speak and assemble peacefully here tonight.
The convention for Wallace was a success.
You have heard the resolution. All in favor signify by saying aye.
More than enough Nebraskans signed up to get their candidate on the ballot.
That's for Wallace.
The convention for Omaha was a disaster. That night, whites driving on the near north side were dragged from their cars and beaten. A black teenager was shot to death by an off-duty police officer guarding a pawn shop.
And I don't care whether they're black or white or whether who they are, we're going to enforce the law. And we're not going to play hanky-panky. And we're serious about it.
Now let the mayor declare an emergency. Let him say he's going to close all businesses in a part of the town as this ordinance gives him the right to do. And you know how they're going to close the barbershop where I work? With shotguns and gas.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was shot outside of...
Just 2 months later, 1968 would test Omaha again. An assassin murdered Dr. Martin Luther King. Big cities burned. Omaha mourned and held its breath.
We don't want anybody hurt. And I'm telling you personally, cool it, baby. We are outgunned, we are outmanned, and we are surrounded. You understand? Now is the time for us to get smart, not mad.
Omaha did stay cool. Omaha did stay calm. But the face-slap politics of George Wallace and the ugly confrontation that followed became only the first act in the drama of 1968. What made it all matter would not be the outcome, but the effect it would have on the participants in the wildest 3 months in the history of Nebraska politics. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, a very conservative time, Nebraska remained a very conservative state.
Low taxes, major freedom for the individual, I think pretty well summarized most Republicans then, and a good many Democrats too.
All three congressmen, both senators, Hruska and Curtis, and even the progressive young governor, Norbert Tiemann, ran as Republicans ranging from hard right to moderate.
And it's going to require the cooperation of all of us.
Nebraska picked Democrat Frank Morrison as governor for 2 terms, but it was still tough for the minority party to win a big election.
Different people that came together and put those coalitions together in the late 50s and early 60s then became that Democratic Party.
This is the essential principle of the democratic process. You present yourself to the people. You present your ideas, and they're going to make the judgments.
John Green's father, Jim, fell short when he ran for high office, but time and again, he helped other people's campaigns. When John F. Kennedy ran for president in 1960, it was Jim Green he called to run the operation in Nebraska.
He was the one who could put all of the different and disparate parts of the Democratic Party in Nebraska together.
You didn't deal with him from a matter of right or wrong. You dealt with him from a matter of electability. Is it going to work? Is that where the support is?
Democrats found some success in Omaha, specifically in the Douglas County Courthouse.
South Omaha Irish Democrats were the big names.
They would be the Kavanaughs and the Mundlings.
You had your Greens and you had your Howells.
The Howells, the Kavanaughs.
Sam Howell was king of the courthouse.
The Knowles Howell machine. It was a great machine.
Now that was a machine. And the South Omaha machine, that we've always talked about the South Omaha machine. Those were very loyal, dedicated people, and the leaders in there were identifiable, and they produced.
I would never characterize it as machine politics, although some people would love to have said that, but Omaha never had anything close to a machine except way back in the 1900s or so, and that happened to be a Republican machine.
Sam Howell's daughter Ann would eventually lead the state Democratic Party.
He would take them under their wing and either tell them where they should be visiting and who they should be talking to and giving them sound advice. And they developed good friendships over that.
Ann Howell married Mike Boyle, who got a job in 1968 at the county courthouse.
I was chief deputy election commissioner. Douglas County was a real stronghold for the Democratic Party. All the offices in the county were held by Democrats, and it was always a safe place to come and very loyal and good turnout for all the Democrats all across the state.
You know, they were the old guard, and they weren't about to let the young guard in unless you're related or you know, close friends. And so it took a while to break down some of those barriers. I'm not sure they're completely broke down yet.
Everything about the old way of doing things was being challenged in the 1960s. The civil rights movement, rock and roll, drugs.
I call the hippies my people, and their philosophy my philosophy. Because these people have a beautiful philosophy, but they got hung up on drugs on the way.
I just can't believe that the right of free speech should be construed as a license to use foul language, to make indiscriminate attacks on our flag, on our people, on our country, or on our chief executive.
It was the war, the Vietnam War, that haunted everyone.
Last summer I burned my draft card, and in November I sent a letter to my draft board advising them that I would not cooperate with them in any way whatsoever in the future.
The anti-war movement desperately wanted to find a candidate for president who could challenge the establishment.
They tried Robert Kennedy, he didn't want to do it, a number of other candidates, but Gene McCarthy stepped up to the plate.
I don't think we're winning the war. I don't say we've lost it, but I think that we've reached a point where we ought to proceed to try to settle it without trying to decide who won or who lost.
So Eugene McCarthy, the junior senator from Minnesota, began a campaign for president driven by young, idealistic newcomers to the political process.
I wish I could say I was really in tune with the anti-war movement and was very aware of what was going on. I had no awareness at all.
Encouraged by friends, Christine Howells left her Connecticut girls' school to tag along with the McCarthy presidential campaign for the fun of it.
He needed 4 McCarthy girls. We would accompany him and go out ahead of him with flyers to say, "Come meet Senator Gene McCarthy."
The President of the United States.
President Johnson had badly bungled Vietnam, dragging the country deeper and deeper into an unpopular war. Still, McCarthy seemed like a long shot until the first primary election of '68.
Governor John King in New Hampshire had said that a vote for McCarthy would be greeted by cheers in Hanoi. And anybody who would vote for him was, basically a traitor. So when he got 42% of the popular vote, something obviously had happened.
Just days later, President Johnson announced to the nation he would not seek another term in office.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
President Johnson made the supreme political sacrifice because he feels that the welfare of our nation required it.
It was a shock. I think it was a shock to everybody. It was very hard in those days to unseat an incumbent, no matter who they were. It was real difficult to unseat a president in the middle of a war. It was almost unheard of.
But I'm pleased to be here, and I'm pleased to be involved in the primary. When I last was talking to President Johnson,
An open race for president put the spotlight back on Robert Kennedy.
he said, "Go west, young man."
Any loyalty to LBJ, the man who led the country after his brother's assassination, no longer blocked Bobby's desire to become president.
I thought he was trying to tell me something as I was in California at the time. But
I called my father and I said, well, it looks like things have changed. Your candidate, Johnson, is now out of the race. He says, Johnson, let me tell you what I've been doing. And he had already been in contact with the Kennedy people then, and they had already started this plan to use Nebraska as a way to get him into the race and to make him successful in the race.
You think he can win in Nebraska?
I believe Senator Kennedy can win in Nebraska. The campaign is at the beginning. But if we didn't think there were that possibility of winning in Nebraska, we wouldn't be in Nebraska.
With 3 candidates now in the presidential race, we certainly cannot expect harmony until after the convention in Chicago.
Nearly every big-name Democrat running to be a Nebraska delegate to the state convention lined up early with President Johnson. Suddenly uncommitted, they faced unexpected competition for the leadership of the party.
I wouldn't want to describe it as a split in the party, but I think most people think this country has got to have a unifying spirit again.
Just hours after LBJ's political earthquake rocked America, it was clear that voters in Nebraska would have a voice as Nebraska chose the candidates for president in 1968.
this is the spirit I want to see leading the United States in the coming year, and that is why I run for President of the United States.
When respect for the United States sinks that low, it's time for a new president that will restore respect for the United States around the world.
Richard Nixon was back. It had been a long road since John Kennedy edged him out in the campaign for president 8 years earlier.
In 1962, when he ran for governor of California and was defeated, and said notably that they weren't going to have Nixon to kick around anymore because he was through.
I believe that the Republicans in '68 will be more united than the Democrats because we have more recently been through the experience of knowing the cost of division. That's what I think will happen.
in going around the country talking to Republican groups, that removed some of the horns that people thought he had.
Republican John Y. McCollister managed to win a seat on the Douglas County Board among all those Democrats. Across the state, Republicans were finding new life. The young Republicans in Lincoln had one of their best recruiting years ever, in spite of the rebellious mood in America. The leader of that drive, Kay Orr, would be named Young Republican of the Year. A national poll of college students revealed even deeper conservative roots at the University of Nebraska, Omaha.
The National Collegiate Presidential Primary showed Richard Nixon tallying 202 first-choice votes, Robert Kennedy with 167, and Eugene McCarthy with 78. So there you go. But nationally, it was the opposite.
Only the University of North Dakota gave Nixon more support than UNO.
These are the Americans that I've been speaking to. You inspire me, and it means that you're going to give us the great overwhelming majority that we need to give America the new leadership that this great country deserves.
While America seemed to be in chaos, Richard Nixon promised the country stability.
With the riots of the 60s and the civil unrest, so many people wanted a restoring of law and order, peace, if you will. In Nebraska, that was important.
I say the American people can't afford 4 more years of the failures of the past 4 years. We need new leadership, we need new vision, and you're going to provide that.
Especially in Middle America, people were looking for action against the drug culture, the riots, the threat of political assassination.
If a man really wants to go out and assassinate somebody else, he can do it if he's willing to take the risks that are involved. I'm not concerned about it, to be fair. I think it's probably talk that goes on when perhaps they've had too much pot or whatever it is they take.
We must recognize that the great social problems and conflicts of the 60s cannot be solved by the slogans of the 40s.
Enter the governor of New York, and namesake to one of the richest families in America, Nelson Rockefeller. Rocky, they called him, represented the liberal wing of the Republican Party.
It has led the forces of division run loose among us, the forces of intolerance and injustice and indifference, until these forces have grown into the ugliest shape on the American scene.
Well, he was liberal, East Coast, for more government, all the things you want to say. He was bad news.
Rockefeller wanted to be the Kennedy of the Republican Party, it seemed to me at the time, and he really wanted the kids to like him, resonate with them, and it was tough. It was a tough sell.
The most conservative wing of the party didn't like the choices.
We have nothing against Nixon.
Was this to say that you think that Richard Nixon could not win in November if he got the nomination?
Well, let us say we think Ronald Reagan could.
Ronald Reagan became governor of California just a year earlier. As the new hope for small government Republicans, his name on the ballot in Nebraska would be his first test anywhere as a presidential candidate.
We believe that Governor Reagan's views and his type of administration is just what we need for this hour.
To the great irritation of Richard Nixon, Reagan would run in Nebraska without ever setting foot in the state that year.
I think I'll still win it. Of course, I should, because I'm here campaigning.
As crazy as the world seemed in 1968, daily life in Nebraska kept on an even keel for most people.
I was an engineer at Northern Natural Gas with 3 kids. So, I wasn't into the counterculture.
Lou Lamberty and his wife Pat lived a Leave It to Beaver kind of life in Omaha.
Yeah, I wasn't paying that much attention to the politics of the town per se. I was new in town. I didn't know the political system.
He said our soldiers are fighting with one hand tied behind their back. And he said
the background noise from the nightly news disturbed the couple.
Private Scarborough fought valiantly and effectively until he fell mortally wounded. His personal bravery...
Reports about the war in Vietnam raised questions they'd never thought to ask.
Kids were being killed all the time. Vietnamese were being killed all the time. I couldn't figure out why we were there. It just didn't make any sense at all. And then somehow I decided whatever I could do about it, I would.
Lou and Pat Lamberty volunteered to help Eugene McCarthy get elected president.
Gene McCarthy, more than anybody else, grabbed people like us almost in a non-political way. It wasn't that he was a Democrat or a Republican, it was that he had a specific stand on a specific issue that I cared about.
The Lambertys got plenty of help. A small army of McCarthy volunteers roared into Nebraska.
We had just lost to Kennedy in Indiana, so the national staff decided at that point we have got to blitz Nebraska. This is the make it or break it primary for us. I wasn't a McCarthy girl anymore. My job was to help get the canvassing packet set up and make sure that the information came back and got logged in properly, so that on election day we could pull people to the polls.
Gene McCarthy was the favorite of students and of the anti-war movement because he got into it when it was tough going.
I go on campuses now where the administrators come up to me and say, "We want to thank you for what you've done to our campus, giving the students a sense of adulthood and of participation."
You know, there was a real change of young people. It was just starting. Like, you know, we don't have to take this anymore. We can make a difference. Now, this certainly wasn't San Francisco here in Omaha, Nebraska, but it was starting.
Here is an honest man, a man who means what he says, a man who obviously will do what he says. And people are tired of being lied to in this country.
There was hope with Clean Gene for a while.
Yeah, but it was really the issues and not his personality. He wasn't nearly as charismatic as the young people thought he was, and that's why Bobby Kennedy was so good once he got in. And people were very angry about Bobby coming in after Gene had cleared the path.
I suspect that what we thought was, well, you son of a gun, you didn't have the courage to come in when you should have, we're going to whip you.
McCarthy's campaign got its energy from young volunteers with a passion for a cause. The Kennedy campaign built its strength on an experienced political organization.
We really decided in 1968, and that's why this primary is so important.
When
That's
they
why
came
the
in,
primary is...
they took over the Fontenelle Hotel. They lived in the Fontenelle Hotel. The campaign was in the Fontenelle Hotel. It not just became the headquarters, it became everybody's home for those 2 months. And in our family, it became the family occupation or event.
We are out to try and allow as many people in Nebraska as possibly can to see Senator Kennedy face to face.
Senator Robert Kennedy's special train rolled into Nebraska early this morning. The crowds, made up of young and old alike, remain spirited down the line. I remember riding on the train with him across the state of Nebraska. I was Ethel Kennedy's bridge partner from Scottsbluff to Grand Island.
Senator from New York and candidate for President of the United States.
Bobby Kennedy's whistle-stop tour along the Union Pacific line brought out Nebraskans like few other events in the state's history.
It was lively, it was upbeat. That's something Americans wanted at that time.
And I think we can do much better here in the United States.
Every town that they stopped in, the crowds would get larger and larger. And they were farther and farther behind as the train was coming across because they couldn't get these people off the tracks.
I know the importance of the state of Nebraska, I know the importance of your vote, but the fact is that we could do much better than we've done in the past, and I intend to do so if I'm elected President of the United States.
When we got in Omaha, the crowd was so hyped up and excited. I remember losing a tie clasp and a cuff link, and people were just grabbing everything.
Candidates needed more than crowds. They needed help. Before TV ads overwhelmed the airwaves and computers introduced campaigning by email, hundreds of volunteers would go door to door canvassing potential voters.
Well, canvassing is simply knocking on the door and giving whoever answers the door some information about your candidate, and if you can, engage them in a conversation, and if you can, make a sale.
If it turns out you're talking to a hawk, emphasize the following: inflation, tax increases, credibility gap, McCarthy not for unilateral withdrawal or abandoning our boys. McCarthy is a man you can trust. My, what a nice dog you have. Make the visit brief and pleasant. Impressions are important. Those were our canvassing instructions.
The focus in the Kennedy campaign was to get out the vote. The idea that out of every 4 African American registered voters, 75% of them would more than likely vote for Kennedy.
African Americans were lining up to register, and one of the persons said to her, "What's your party affiliation?" And this woman said, "Kennedy." So we had to talk to the lady and tell her that if you want to vote for Kennedy, you have to be registered as a Democrat in the primary, but if you're a Republican, his name will be on your ballot. Oh, I want to be a Democrat then.
Okay, and you lived in Douglas County how long?
When registrations came in, they were at the time an all-time high. The office was working literally around the clock. We'd close the doors, but people would stay and trying to process everything to get it into books to take them to the polling places.
Kennedy's campaign benefited from voter registration drives. The crowds at his events dwarfed McCarthy's.
The Kennedys have such a hard time trying to make themselves the underdogs in this campaign.
One-on-one, when he was shaking people's hands, he came across very well. But when he got up in front of a group of people and began talking, he spoke in very philosophical terms. And his position was very well articulated, but most people just glazed over.
He was actually kind of a strange bird to be a politician, because I'm not sure that I didn't ever have the feeling that he particularly enjoyed doing some of the things you have to do to be in politics.
What bothered me was that in the recent studies of the Gallup poll, it showed that Senator Kennedy ran much better among the less educated.
Nothing seemed to aggravate Eugene McCarthy more than Bobby Kennedy claiming to be the candidate with the moral stand on the Vietnam War.
Now, I understand that is a matter of controversy. But we're going to come to that, too. We've been bombing Hanoi. We've dropped more bombs on North Vietnam and South Vietnam than we dropped on Germany during the whole Second World War. What else can you bomb? Who else can you kill?
When he came to Creighton, I went and I stood, and it was just that aura, that, my gosh, he had such empathy. You just listened. You wanted so badly to believe that this guy could lead us and take us to where we wanted to go.
Obviously the Kennedys had learned that it isn't always the audience that you're speaking to that's your audience. It's you guys with the cameras that is important. And if he's got enough courage to go into a Catholic university and take on the college students, what better place to do it?
The most prominent member of the nation's most prominent Catholic family came to Creighton University and took on the president and the generals and the students standing before him.
And have that large number of students who raised their hand and said students should be deferred and let the poor people go and fight the war. If you're a black person, you've got twice as much chance of being drafted as if you're a white person if you're eligible. How can you accept that in the United States? You can't accept it in the United States, and you should be the last people to accept it in this country. So there.
It reinforced the whole idea of why we backed him. You had a leader that was able and willing and looked at himself from a standpoint that if he didn't say it, who was going to say it?
There was a huge amount of interest that was generated by their presence. They just kind of built and built and built until Election Day came, and then all hell broke loose.
Celebrities found themselves dropped in the middle of Tecumseh or Hastings to attract a crowd for their candidate. Sitcom actress Marlo Thomas, astronaut John Glenn, Paul Newman, fresh from starring in Cool Hand Luke.
Paul Newman's coming. Why is Paul Newman coming? It doesn't make any difference. Paul Newman is coming.
I think anybody connected with this administration is going to have a tough time negotiating. I think the only man who has, some possibility of meaningful and trustworthy negotiations is Eugene McCarthy.
I will never forget the blue of his eyes. I was like a little puppy at the fence. Just, if I could just see those eyes one more time.
My most vivid memory of Nebraska is being in the Schooler building at a phone bank and having Peter Yarrow, Peter, Paul, and Mary, wander in with his guitar, sit on a desk, and start to play. It was way cool, as we would say today.
Again, Bobby Kennedy had the upper hand. His family, Mother Rose, the sisters, they all qualified as celebrities.
The Kennedys represented almost the closest thing to royalty in the United States. They were wealthy.
When Joan Kennedy came to campus, she was campaigning for Robert, of course. You know, you could not talk to the woman without having, at least from my perspective, a crush on her. She was just so good.
It just seemed like there was a heck of a lot of media floating around, and again, it was a brand new thing for us, so we were kind of amazed by it all.
More headlines. Just days before the primary, Hubert Humphrey, Vice President of the United States, confirmed he would challenge McCarthy and Kennedy.
The senator said he welcomes Hubert Humphrey into the presidential race, saying the entrance offers voters a clear alternative between present policies and new programs.
Hubert was a great campaigner, I thought, and I also thought he was a good speaker. The joke about him is he talked 1,000 words a second, and with gusts up to 1,500.
We have the capacity, we have the ability, we have the resources. But the question for this generation, and for mine too, is one, do we have the will?
Humphrey was kind of the liberal's liberal, you know, where you listen to him and you think, God, this guy's great. He's really smart. He's bright. And then you think for a second and go, nah, it's not going to work. He never had a thought that he didn't express.
He was a talker. Talk, talk, talk. I just thought, do you ever stop? Just talk, 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 talk.
Hubert Humphrey was the happy warrior. Here's a guy who is basically a liberal, who was a great human being, a wonderful speaker who had all the right instincts, and yet he was trapped in this role of being the loyal vice president to Lyndon Johnson.
He was just as bad as Johnson. He was one of the old guard. He was one of the establishment.
If the president wasn't running, Nebraska's establishment Democrats stuck with the next best thing, the vice president.
But we believe that in order to bring about some harmony of all factions and to bring them together after the convention, it is essential that we now stand firm behind our commitments to President Johnson.
After President Kennedy was assassinated and Johnson took over and Humphrey was his running mate, I just felt, I don't know, I guess was maybe kind of a hack even at that age, but I just felt allegiance to the vice president, and so that's how I felt.
The state's Democrats, especially the always reliable Irish Catholic vote, built its power base on President John Kennedy's campaign 8 years earlier. These were different times. The Douglas County courthouse split. Sam Howell held firm with the vice president.
I don't know what he saw differently from John Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy, and not to be disparaging, but he did not see the same things in him that he saw in Jack Kennedy, which was even more inspiring to him.
I remember he said that he had talked to Bobby, had met with him, Senator Kennedy, several times, and he just kind of dismissed him. He's kind of a smart aleck.
Humphrey wanted to use Nebraska to make his mark before the Democratic convention. Claiming to have no organized campaign, he hoped to get enough write-in votes to challenge Kennedy. He had the perfect platform to make the point.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you, thank you.
The weekend before the primary election, every big-name Democrat in the state was in Omaha for the biggest party fundraiser of the year.
We can join all of the good Democrats together for one solemn and noble purpose, namely the defeat of any Republican that dares to challenge us.
Before the auditorium was filled, it was packed.
It was very electric. People were really excited to be in that room. It was the place to be.
Humphrey needed to convince the Nebraska Democrats that he remained the party's best chance and America's best hope, even if Kennedy and McCarthy were the names actually on the ballot.
There are two fine men that are contesting for your attention and your votes. And if you have any trouble deciding which one to vote for, call me up, and I may give you some advice.
Eugene McCarthy declined to speak that night, leaving the evening to Humphrey and Bobby Kennedy.
I clearly remember them walking down, shaking hands with, because Mike and I were both at the head table and they shook hands with us. But what struck me was Bobby Kennedy had the bluest eyes I've ever seen.
I remember when Senator Kennedy shook my hand, I didn't notice his blue eyes. What I did notice, though, was that he wasn't looking at me. He was looking beyond, shaking hands, and he was looking right over my shoulder at the crowd. So I figured, that's okay. So that's what he was doing, you know, to see what was going on.
And he lost your vote.
He lost my vote.
This most fateful year, we must speak plainly before we comfort, instruct before we reassure, reveal and discuss frustration before we promise satisfaction. We can be proud of what we have built, but pride must not lead to complacency.
The next morning, while the vice president met behind closed doors with the state's most influential Democrats, Kennedy's campaign prepared for a historic event in Omaha, the first visit of a presidential campaign to the near North Side and the city's black voters.
Here was a gentleman going out in the community, in a part of the community most candidates would somewhat shy away from, if not totally shy away from.
Eugene McCarthy had volunteers in black neighborhoods, but one frustrated worker, John Beasley, told a reporter their entire budget was only $20. And Kennedy's national staff nearly canceled the North Omaha visit, but the local team pushed for it.
The burden was on us to produce and make sure that it went off without a click. We had some grassroots tricks. We had 3 marching bands that got excused from school, so the noise was like a magnet.
With the TV cameras in mind, the original location moved from a parking lot to an intersection, squeezing the crowd in tight and making it look gigantic.
It's like having 10,000 people show up. Downtown Wisdom said that we would be lucky to have 150. Cheers, yells, hysteria. But in the midst of it all, it was pouring down rain and nobody went home. To have a presidential candidate come to Omaha and then come down to North Omaha was beyond anybody's wildest dreams. It was just history being made.
If I'm elected President of the United States, I'm going to work for those who are deprived, those who are poor, those who lack jobs, those who lack decent education, and lack a decent housing, whether they be white or black. That I pledge.
It's just phenomenal thinking about it 40 years later, because of the identification they felt for him. Still, the pain of the death of his brother was evident in everyone. That human loss was still there.
I ask your help, not just in protest, not just to complain about the conditions under which you exist or under the conditions under which your children exist, but let's make a change ourselves and let's bring that change here in the year 1968 and let's begin to do it here in Omaha and the state of Nebraska tomorrow on Tuesday, May 17th. Will you help me?
We accomplished a lot. We accomplished a lot in a short period of time, and we bucked professional wisdom that it couldn't be done, and we did it.
For Republicans, primary day became anticlimactic.
Well, we'll switch now to the Republican column. It is Richard Nixon with a very fine margin over Ronald Reagan.
It made Richard Nixon a viable candidate because he was there, he was on the ballot, he had won, that's it.
Ronald Reagan surprised everyone. Nearly 1 in 5 Nebraska Republicans voted for him, even without a single day of campaigning in person. It was Reagan's first real show of strength on his long road to the White House.
He started something. He brought back the concept of the founders of limited government, and he did it so engagingly that it lasted.
Now, how do you figure the popularity contest is going to come out? Do you think Kennedy can win it?
Well, we're working in every way we can to win it, and we want to win it.
For Democrats, there were 2 elections going on at once. Casting a vote for a candidate got the press attention, but that did nothing to get the candidate nominated.
Well, the popular vote was important simply because it showed strength, but the delegates were the real game.
Voting for the delegates on a second ballot made the difference at the national convention.
You could be voting for McCarthy and then turn around and vote for uncommitted, and so you were really voting for Humphrey or whoever. So they were not connected.
We were harvesting a whole crop of voters that probably would show up to the polls and vote for him. But it's a very tense situation until the results come.
I was so tired. I mean, I spent my entire week in Omaha either in the Schooler building or in the Blackstone Hotel. I was working those phone banks, working those canvassing operations, and I never really saw daylight.
We ran out of ballots. I remember this so well, it was unbelievable, but particularly on the north side, the turnout was historic. They were tearing the sample ballots off the wall and doing chicken scratches, trying to somehow record their votes. I mean, it was just overwhelming.
Well, the computers started digesting all the vote tallies shortly after 4 o'clock this afternoon.
The returns came in quickly, so it wasn't a cliffhanger. As a young person, it was definitely exciting.
As they're gearing up towards Election Day, it's not only vote for Senator Kennedy, it's vote for these delegates, and those delegates won, every one of them.
Jim Green and the Kennedy delegates also pushed most of the party's big shots off the floor of the Democratic National Convention, and they resented it.
Certainly they did. I've been to every convention since Roosevelt, and you're not going to deny me. I'm sorry, that's how it was.
The torch has been passed to a new generation. We are going to do it. They created a genre of hope, and they did it very well.
Eugene McCarthy's campaign felt the jolt immediately, facing the 2 big primary elections in Oregon and then California.
Yeah, we were bussed down to the Lincoln headquarters the day after the primary, and then read off from a list of names those who were being sent home and those who were going to go on to the West Coast, because the campaign was running out of money and they had to lay off about half the people. It was very traumatic for everybody.
In the following 2 weeks, Senator Robert Kennedy lost the Oregon primary, but rallied to win in California with the most support he'd seen since his campaign began. And then it ended.
Senator Kennedy has been shot.
I'll never forget the morning I woke up and turned on TV and said, Robert Kennedy is dead. And it was just, I couldn't believe it. And I went running to the stairs. I said, Mike, he's dead. It was a horrible time in our lives.
It changes everything, and it takes politics out of the hands of the voters and into the hands of anarchists, and that's always a bad thing, and we all knew it.
Twice, Jim Green managed Kennedy family campaigns in Nebraska. Twice, Jim Green traveled to Arlington National Cemetery to attend a Kennedy funeral.
Physically, you could see that just how sad he was through the whole thing and trying to keep everybody else's spirits up. On the 14th of June was the Democratic Convention out in Hastings, giving a speech about how we were going to hold the Kennedy delegates together and we would deliver ourselves as a block to somebody at some point in time, and said, "I feel sick," and died of a heart attack. In the family, we always said that, there were 2 bullets in that gun.
When I was on the plane coming back the next morning, I was an operative in California. I was in shock. I just basically checked out of politics. It was an era where you had the assassination of John Kennedy. You had Bobby Kennedy's situation in that whole time frame, and you had the assassination of Martin Luther King and then Malcolm X. And so the disillusionment, as for me, was one that was almost like, what's the use? What's the use? And I stayed out of politics for a long time.
For Democrats, the year never got better. Hubert Humphrey became the party's candidate for president. The convention in Chicago descended into chaos. Yippies protested, and police went on the attack. November rolled around, and Nebraska gave Richard Nixon the highest percentage of support of any of the 50 states, as he became President of the United States at the end of 1968.
It was an interesting year because there was a great deal of hope in the early part of the year, and a lot of activity and lots of work, and we can make things better, and then it just fell off. And it fell off when Bobby Kennedy died, it fell off in Chicago, it fell off when Hubert Humphrey did not turn out to be a very good candidate. We had these huge changes, and the hope was gone.
I came out of the 1968 primary thinking, this is cool, this is the way it's always going to be. Then came 72, and it was not like that, and it has never been like that.
Over the next 10 years, both Democrats and Republicans would find plenty to be cynical about. The Vietnam War dragged on, Watergate. But the veterans of the 1968 campaigns, they found reasons to stay connected.
Instead of dropping out of politics, I got very involved in politics. It got me into the system, and I stayed in the system.
An assassination may have kept Nebraska from influencing presidential politics, but there's another reason these few frantic weeks mattered in the state's history and in the lives of those who took part in these campaigns.
You're dealing with people that are like you and concerned about a better world, a better way of doing things.
In December of '68, John Y. McCollister announced he'd run for Congress. He was the first of the graduating class of the '68 campaigns of an entire generation of Nebraska government and political leaders.
Will you do that?
I would say that event is one of the most meaningful exercises of me using my talents to the good. I really feel good about that.
In the 1970s, an entire group of young political upstarts surged into the Nebraska state legislature. In the years that followed, others became lobbyists and political party leaders, mayors, and governors.
I think it did light the fires for future politicians. They got involved in politics, they saw how much fun it could be, how exciting it could be. It was a good primer for how politics can work.
Given the students a sense of adulthood and of participation, of some worth, of their being in a position to influence the life of America.
The people who worked for Gene McCarthy stayed involved, I think, for some different reasons, and they had to do with breaking open the Democratic Party machine in their state and realizing that they could have influence.
We seek peace at home, and we seek peace abroad.
I will never walk away from those things, and I can never walk away from believing in the rights of human beings, because fundamentally we are all the same, regardless of who we are, what we are, or where we are in this world.
For the national government alone, for all its powers, panaceas, and programs, cannot by itself resolve these problems and conflicts.
One of the things that was preached during that time is we may not win this election, but we aren't giving up the cause. Don't give up the cause.
And let's make freedom from fear a reality in America again, right here in the United States of America.
People with great ideas who are able to state things in really inspirational ways are always worth listening to, and their lead is always worth taking into account when you're figuring out what you want to do with your life. And I think that was true then, and I think it's true now.
It happened because the American people, in their deep wisdom, sensed the special nature of this year and the challenge that it is posing to our most fundamental values and our most fundamental beliefs.
Other than a great moment in time for all of us, it was once again an arrested moment because of the tragedy. The hard work that went there was taken away from them, but the dreams and the ideals still existed.
Mr. President of the United States.
Visit our 68 website if you'd like to see more archival film of the presidential candidates, historic campaign documents, and newspaper clippings, and for a chance to share your own memories and observations about politics of the 1960s.